Well, good afternoon, folks. We're going to go ahead and get started. I know some of you are still logging on, so welcome. Hope you had a great holiday weekend and have had a good Tuesday thus far. It's been a bit rainy and cloudy here in Lincoln, so hopefully some folks in different parts of the state got to have a little bit of sunshine today, but we're definitely glad to have you here with us today as we dive into our conversation around unfinished learning in literacy. I did want to point out that we have last Thursday's webinar. If you joined us or you were not able to join us, it's posted on the website that you see on the screen, and we'll get that in the chat box. It's where we're posting everything. So the video recordings are on our YouTube channel, so you're welcome to share those with anyone that you'd like, as well as some of the tools and resources, and we also have the slides posted. I did go ahead and put up, again, just a reminder of Twitter handles for not only myself, but SchoolKit, and some of the efforts we're utilizing the hashtag Launch Nebraska. So feel free to tweet out the conversation today as we dive deeper into our work around unfinished learning for literacy. Just as a reminder, we have 10 webinars. This is number 4. So over the next few weeks, we'll continue our efforts in thinking about summer learning. And really, again, our goal is to provide clear, actionable and information and tools and templates for school districts and school systems to utilize as they are making plans for summer learning. And then we will shift our focus in mid-June to the focus on the fall. So I know folks are really anxious to continue planning for fall, but we also know that this is a really great time to think about summer learning. I might mention that on Friday, the department released some guidance for summer school and summer learning. There's also specific guidance around supporting students with disabilities in this space. And then hopefully by tomorrow, we'll have considerations for health as it relates to summer learning as well. Like our previous webinars, we're excited to have SchoolKit help us with this effort. They're no stranger to Nebraska, and I'm excited that Julia's with us today. She made the trip to Grand Island, Nebraska last summer, and so we're excited to have her join us as we start the conversation on literacy. So Julia, I'm going to kick it over to you.
Thanks so much, Corey. Yes, it was a pleasure to be with many of you, I'm sure, in Grand Island last year. And it really is an honor to be here with you today. Unfortunately, we can't be in person, but I'm grateful to have you all here on this webinar with me. I am Julia, as Corey said. I am the Director of Literacy at SchoolKit. I am a former teacher and curriculum developer, and I'm based in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, which is where I grew up. When I'm not working, I'm an aspiring home chef. I'm pushing myself to try out some new recipes here and there. And I'm also a chronic pushover when it comes to requests for more bedtime stories from this guy over here, who is Jack, my son, who just turned 3 last week. So I'm really excited to dive in here with you. As we begin, I just wanted to share some norms and tips for best engaging with today's session. If you've been on the previous webinars, these will not be new to you, but I just wanted to go through them in case we are lucky enough to have some new folks joining us today. So due to the nature of this format, I will be doing much of the talking, but we'll also ask you to review and reflect on some materials. And while this is a webinar and there could be technical difficulties, we do appreciate in advance your patience if something like that does arise, and just know that we will work together through any challenges that come up. But if you personally have a tech issue or another question, please chat those into the Q&A feature. Our team behind the scenes will be able to support you with tech, and that's also where we will collect some content-specific questions to follow up with. We also recommend that you go to the view options in your Zoom screen to exit full screen in order to better access some links that we'll share. My teammate Kaylee will be sharing these links to documents that we'll ask you to review periodically, and they're just a little bit easier to see if you're not in full screen. And finally, as Corey mentioned, the recording and a copy of all the materials will be available following today's session. So we encourage you to share and revisit. Finally, we will also ask you to use the chat feature occasionally throughout the webinar. This will just help us to kind of hear your thoughts and reflections, and so please be ready to just engage in the chat box when prompted. So as you know, today's webinar is focused on how we can best address unfinished learning in ELA. And to frame this challenge, we're going to revisit this powerful data that you saw in webinar number 1 and that Brian referred to last week in the math webinar. So this graph showcases the learning loss predicted in ELA as a result of early school closures. So note here that the solid lines show the typical growth and summer slide that students would experience, while the dotted line shows the impact as a result of early school closures from COVID. So take just a moment to review this graph on your own. Preliminary COVID slide estimates suggest that students are going to return in fall 2020 with roughly 70% of the learning gains in reading relative to a typical school year. So what this means is that there's a predicted 30% learning loss in ELA, and this is significant. And we know this because we're all here today united around this common goal of supporting students who do return with unfinished learning in ELA. So as we engage in this learning over the course of today's webinar, please keep our 3 guiding principles in mind. I know that Brian introduced these to you last week on the math webinar, and these principles are really just meant to support and guide your thinking as you plan for teacher and students to return in the fall. So our first principle is to put people first. Although the webinar will be focused mainly on content and academics, we also want to name the importance of caring for and supporting people during this really challenging time. So leading from a place of empathy and compassion and making sure that we have the systems and structures in place to support our communities who may be returning with stress, anxiety is really important. Our second principle is to take an integration approach to supporting unfinished learning instead of a remediation approach. In math, this meant prioritizing missed standards and integrating that learning into grade level content. And in ELA, as we'll explore today, we'll also take a type of integration approach by planning and providing just-in-time supports for grade level content. Finally, our third principle is to keep it simple and focused. We know that this is easier said than done, especially during times when things are changing so rapidly. But we just want to take the approach of trying not to overcomplicate things and just knowing and rest assured that you don't have to reinvent the wheel here. You don't have to change everything. A lot of what you'll hear today will resonate as best practices for literacy instruction for any time. And so we hope that that will support you in keeping things simple and focused as you do this really critical work. Here is our focus for today's session. I'll give you just a moment to read that focus yourself. We are going to zoom in on a research-based approach for planning to support students with unfinished learning in ELA when they return to school. We are also going to focus on some key leader and teacher actions to support the implementation of this work. And so since we'll go through both some leader and teacher actions, we encourage you to think about what you can do as leaders and also how you can communicate and share some of this relevant key learning with your teachers as you engage them in this work. So before we dive in, it's really important for us to distinguish how the approach to unfinished learning in ELA is different than the approach that we shared last week for math. You'll remember from the math webinar that the recommended approach was to address unfinished learning that in a way that included tracing the coherence of standards across grade levels to identify opportunities to address that unfinished learning from the previous grade within the current grade. This involved focusing on the major work of the grade and then embedding and supporting additional work where necessary. In this approach for math, we relied heavily on the coherence of the standards to determine what content and skills were most essential to teach in an integrated way alongside grade level content. But in ELA, the approach is different. Instead of asking ourselves, what standards did my students miss this spring? We need to be asking ourselves, what knowledge and supports do my students need most in order to access this grade level complex text? In ELA, rather than focus on tracing standards and skills across grade levels, We are focused on the text and the specific understanding that it demands from students. So this is certainly not to say that a deep understanding of the vertical progression of Nebraska's ELA standards isn't important. It definitely is. However, our approach to teaching the standards in ELA is fundamentally different than the approach to teaching standards in math. In ELA, we work through and practice standards in a spiraled way in service of making meaning of the text. We don't teach ELA standards for the purpose of mastering them. We teach them because they embody those critical skills and ways of thinking that enable students to make meaning of increasingly complex texts both independently and proficiently. So when it comes to the supports that I'm talking about, research tells us that one of the most important factors in a student's ability to read and understand a text is knowledge. Many of you are likely familiar with a seminal piece of research referred to as the baseball study. Researchers Recta and Leslie wanted to compare the relative impact of knowledge of a topic to the relative impact of reading ability on a student's comprehension of a text. To do this, they had 7th and 8th grade students read a short text about baseball and then tested them for comprehension. The students were divided into 4 groups to account for different combinations of these 2 factors, reading ability and knowledge of the topic of baseball. Here are the results of that study, which show the average comprehension scores for each of the 4 groups. You'll notice that some students classified as low reading ability had significantly better comprehension of this passage than did a group with high reading ability with low knowledge of baseball. The difference between these first 2 groups that you see here was not statistically significant. So what this study tells us is that knowledge has a much greater impact on comprehension than generalized reading ability does. And with prior knowledge and supports, all students can read and understand complex texts. So this study has been replicated since 1988, and findings have been confirmed again by more recent studies. And this is really great news for us because these are findings that can really help us better understand the path forward as we think about supporting unfinished learning in ELA. So this brings us to our essential question for the series and for today. How do we address unfinished learning and literacy in an equitable and shifts-aligned way? Let's dig in. So we say equitable and shifts aligned, but what does shifts aligned really mean? These, as you know, are Nebraska's 3 instructional shifts for literacy, and they embody the essential instructional approaches that we must take to ensure college and career readiness for our students. So first, we have the developing foundational skills in reading for literary and informational text. And this shift really names the importance of regular practice with complex text and a range of other texts to build background knowledge. Second, we have finding and using text evidence to support analysis in reading, writing, and discussion. This shift makes the text the expert in the room, and it grounds students in evidence and a deep understanding of the text to support their thinking, claims, and understanding. Last but definitely not least, we have conducting and publishing research using multiple sources, which encapsulates not only the building of knowledge through multiple texts, but also synthesizing and expressing those ideas and new understandings through writing. So we want to name that you and many of your teachers may already be very well versed in these shifts as their best practices for any time. But we bring them up here because aligning our approach to these shifts will be even more critical than ever in light of all the missed learning this spring in order for us to ensure equitable literacy instruction for all. So here's a summary of this approach that we're about to dig into. When addressing unfinished learning in ELA, it's really important that we first identify and address potential gaps in knowledge instead of isolating standards and skills for reteaching. And it's also important that we plan to stay the course with a high quality curriculum or instructional materials and provide that grade level content to all students. So we're about to dig in deeper to specifics around those 2 recommendations. But before we do, it's important that I stamp one critical point here that we will revisit later on in the webinar. This point is that this approach we just described here does not apply to the foundational skills of reading. Foundational skills must be taught and learned in a progression, and this means that we must provide targeted and systematic foundational skills instruction to all students who need it. Later on in the webinar, we will share some more recommendations around foundational skills of reading and how to support students with unfinished learning in this area. Here's our agenda for the webinar. We are going to spend the next part of our time together digging into the specifics of this equitable and shifts-aligned approach I just shared. So at the heart of this approach, as you see here, is the importance of providing grade-level ELA instruction rooted in complex text to all students. So why does this matter? Let's take a minute to norm on why providing grade-level instruction using complex text is crucial to all students' success. And to do this, we'll look at this quote that you see from the well-known ACT study called Reading Between the Lines. The clearest differentiator in reading between students who are college ready and students who are not is the ability to comprehend complex texts. What does this mean? This means that we must provide all students authentic practice reading complex texts with appropriate teacher support. So before we dive into what does this look like to provide grade level ELA instruction rooted in complex text, we want to first acknowledge some very common counter practices that you may see. We want to bring awareness not only around what is effective related to ELA instruction at this time, but we also want to be really clear about practices that are not effective and can in fact be harmful. So let's explore what some of these counter practices might look like. So let's imagine that during an observation of a 7th grade class, you notice students working in stations. In one station, students are finding the theme of multiple short, unrelated paragraphs, and in the other, they are determining the meaning of unknown words in context. Let's imagine that the 4th grade ELA team creates high, medium, and low versions of a complex article from their curriculum by replacing vocabulary words, editing sentence structure, and deleting paragraphs. Let's imagine that while reviewing a 10th grade teacher's unit plan, you notice that the teacher replaced the anchor text 1984 for the more accessible text The Giver, typically taught in 6th grade. And finally, let's imagine that in an ELA grade level meeting, you observe the 4th grade team creating a remediation unit to reteach isolated skills missed in the last unit of the 3rd grade. They also make a list of students who were not able to access virtual lessons in the spring and plan for the reading specialist to pull these students from ELA class once a week to receive interventions. So while it's important to recognize the really good intentions and the amount of time and work it takes teachers and leaders to organize efforts like the ones we just saw, these are actually, like I said, counter practices to what we will advocate for during this session. Remember, our approach is rooted in providing grade level ELA instruction rooted in complex texts. And thinking back to those examples that we just read, we want to name some common pitfalls that teachers might stumble upon and that can get in the way of doing this. So first, a common pitfall is spending the beginning of the year teaching isolated skills and standards that students missed and focusing on those isolated skills in class. In the scenarios, you will remember that that 7th grade team planned stations for students to practice disconnected skill building, which won't necessarily transfer from text to text. Another common pitfall is replacing or adjusting complex text in a high quality curriculum, such as changing the vocabulary or simplifying the sentence structure. On the last slide, we saw that a 10th grade teacher replaced the novel 1984 with The Giver, typically taught in 6th grade. Though both novels are dystopian literature and they do lead the reader to contemplate some similar themes of authority, utopia, the complexity level of the language, the knowledge, and the structure demands are vastly different. And those of you who know those texts know that The Giver is much less complex. We also saw teachers edit a grade level complex text from a high quality curriculum and make 3 different versions so that students struggled less to comprehend the content. They focused specifically on the parts that made the text grade level, such as making the words easier and shortening the text or editing the syntax. Finally, a pitfall is the urge to revisit or teach units from a previous grade level. In the scenario, the fourth grade team leveraged all their resources to provide supports for missed learning. And this is generally a good practice, but pausing grade level content to create a remediation unit or to teach a unit that was missed will only further the gap for those students. So providing this grade level content rooted in complex texts is something that teachers can control in their planning and in their classrooms. But they can only do this successfully if all students are present and if high expectations from leadership are maintained. If we allow our expectations to dip, or if we allow ourselves to make assumptions, we run the risk of inequitable instruction. And so now let's take a look at what pitfalls leaders may run into related to this that could get in the way of providing grade level instruction rooted in complex texts. Here are the common pitfalls. First of all, we want to avoid making assumptions about students, either based on previous assessment data or their responsiveness or access to lessons that we may have been attempting to get to them this spring and summer. We also do not want to pull students who struggle out of ELA. We want to make sure we preserve that Tier 1 instruction time. And we also want to make sure that we don't assign students to online literacy intervention programs that replace core ELA instruction. And I will put a little plug in for Thursday's webinar. We will go much deeper into these types of systems and structures on Thursday's call that can help support that planning for the fall. So what makes these approaches that we just saw problematic? Let's take a look at this quote from an article called "Struggle is Not a Bad Word." It tells us the types of texts that teachers use with their students is an issue of equity. Teachers must provide a text diet-rich with difficult text to adolescents, including those who may struggle while reading them, to ensure equitable literacy instruction for all. Although the teachers in our scenarios that lowered the levels of those texts or changed tasks to be easier, and the leaders who pulled students from core curriculum instruction for remediation were well-intentioned, the research tells us that these practices could have the opposite of the intended effect, and they could end up actually widening gaps for our students who need the most support. Let's take this idea just a little bit further. You may be familiar with the TNTP study, the opportunity myth, where this graph comes from. Take a moment to orient yourself to this graph as I explain it as well. So every student represented on this graph is a student who started significantly below grade level. You can see that all students represented on this graph started roughly 40 months of learning behind the state average. You can also see that there are two trajectories here. The light green line shows students who are tasked with grade appropriate texts and assignments at least 25% of the time. And the blue line shows students who are tasked with grade appropriate assignments less than 25% of the time. It's important to note that the only thing accounted for here is access to grade level content. That was what made the difference. So you'll see that students who started significantly behind grade level and were given access to grade level content grow exponentially more than students who were not consistently given grade level content. So what this is illustrating is that the instinct to lower content level to meet students where they are is harmful, because the research shows us that they grow more when they're given access to this rigorous content. Lowering the level of the content and lowering the level of the text will not accelerate growth, and it will in fact have the opposite effect, and inequities will increase. So you may be wondering, that's a lot of what not to do. What should we do? What should we be doing instead? And the number one thing we can do when thinking about how to approach unfinished learning in ELA is to ensure that all students have consistent access to grade level instruction rooted in complex texts. But what does this look like? We have a scenario for you that Kaylee is about to chat into the chat bar. We want to give you a few minutes to read this sample vision of success case study that shows what this might look like in action. So please navigate to that link, and as you read, reflect, how did these teachers ensure that all students had access to the complex grade level anchor text? I'll provide about 3 or 4 minutes for you just to read. And when you have 1 or 2 minutes left, I will open up the question for responses in the chat box. So thank you, Kaylee, for chatting those links. Please go ahead and navigate to this vision of success and reflect on that question on the slide. You may still be reading, and that is totally fine. But as you finish reading, we want to hear from you. So please go ahead and respond to the question in the chat. How did teachers ensure that all students had access to the complex grade level anchor text? And I will share out some of the great thinking that I'm seeing come through in the chat. So Michelle said they built background knowledge with the students before reading the text. Building knowledge, so powerful. They focused on prior knowledge. They pre-taught core concepts. They focused on what made the text complex, yes. They explicitly introduced the text structure and enhanced their background knowledge, vocabulary emphasis. Kids were not pulled during until work time so that the core learning was not missed. They used the text to support. They checked in with small groups as needed, but all students got support. They used assessment data, those exit tickets, as a formative check. They used flex days to address challenging parts of the text. Awesome. So more than anything, I'm seeing knowledge. They built vocabulary come through on these chats. Thank you so much. And I do want to name that this vision isn't dependent on a co-teaching team. It's great if you have one, but individual teachers and like grade level teacher teams can do this type of planning too. But what we want you to really pull out of this is the moves that teaching team took to make that grade level text accessible to students without editing the level of the text. And so now let's think about how to bring this to life in our schools. How can we put this research into action? And first and foremost, the research tells us that high quality, shifts in standards aligned instructional materials are critical to ensuring that our students have access to grade level instruction. It is a great starting point, and let's think briefly about what this means for you and your instructional materials. So there's a couple of different ways you can think about this depending on your guidance or on your context. So if you already have high quality instructional materials, stay the course. Your ELA teachers should start teaching Unit 1 of at grade level content in the fall. And if you haven't yet adopted high quality instructional materials, you can think about this in the long term and the short term. You'll want to start thinking about curriculum adoption as part of your long-term strategy for school improvement. And in the short term, you can still evaluate and kind of monitor the instructional materials your teachers are using and point them in the direction of high quality resources. Important to note here that we don't want to go back and teach the previous grade levels units. During Thursday's presentation, we'll talk about how teachers can use the previous grade level content to inform their planning and anticipate areas where students may need more support, but we're not recommending that you go back and you reteach or teach missed units. So we'll pause here for a quick resource spotlight. As I'm sure most of you are familiar with, Nebraska Materials Matter is a great resource if you are considering adopting high quality instructional materials in the future, or if you want to support evaluating your materials that you do have. And also, if you don't have materials in place yet, we know that you might be craving resources in the short term. You can point your teachers in the direction of this resource from Student Achievement Partners. They have guidance on shifts-aligned instruction and ready-to-go shifts-aligned lessons. They also have textbook adaptation guidance to support and streamline existing programs to better align with college and career-ready standards. So while you may be doing other work in the long term, you can take a look at this resource and share it with your teachers in the short term. They're all freely available as well. And before I move on, I do just want to note that we have compiled kind of a quick links page and folder for you with these resource spotlights. So no need to worry about jotting them all down right now. We will make sure to share those out with you and links to these as well after the webinar. Okay, so let's step back into the research. We talked about some leader moves. How can teachers put this research into action? What did we see? So having a high quality curriculum is a great first step, but it's often not enough. And teachers, ELA teachers, are no strangers to adding supports in order for students to access complex texts. But you also must support teachers in understanding that they need to adjust the level and types of support they are providing to students, not the level of the text. So here are 4 specific things that teachers can do, and many of your teachers likely already are doing, to support students to access the grade level texts in their materials. The first, as many of you named in the chat, is to build knowledge through reading of the topic. So powerful, as we saw in that baseball study research. Additionally, we can provide intentional vocabulary support, support with fluency, and we need to help teachers see that scaffolded text-dependent questions are a support that can help students engage in a complex text. It looks simple because it's 4 bullets on a slide, but we all know this is very in-depth, complex work. And so one last resource that we'd like to spotlight for you is this resource from Student Achievement Partners called Supporting All Learners with Complex Text. If you haven't seen this, it's really useful. It's freely available, and it lists out some before, during, and after reading approaches to supports that you can take to help your students access complex text. So how can we make sure that teachers are appropriately adjusting the supports based on student need? This is likely a question many of you are thinking right now. And the most important thing we can do is to avoid making assumptions about students and to help teachers avoid making assumptions about students. Instead, we need to utilize classroom formative assessment data to identify specific student needs and determine which scaffolds and supports might be necessary. And we also should group students flexibly and change groups frequently as needs evolve. In that vision of success that we read, the co-teaching team did just this. They used an exit ticket to determine misconceptions about the content, and they planned for the teacher to pull a small group to support them. So that was a lot. Let's take a minute to just step back and summarize some key do's and don'ts from this conversation. When addressing unfinished learning in ELA, do stay the course with your high quality ELA instructional materials, beginning with Unit 1. Do scaffold to the texts and tasks, not changing or replacing them. And do ensure that all students are given consistent access to unedited complex texts with supports and those high quality instructional materials that you have adopted. And just to really hit the point home, don't spend the beginning of the year teaching isolated skills and standards that student missed. We know that this is not an effective approach to addressing unfinished learning. Make sure that teachers are not replacing or adjusting the text to make them simpler. And finally, make sure we're not teaching those units from earlier grades. So in a moment, we are very excited to hear how you are thinking about how you might apply some of this learning in your context. But before we do, we want to find out who is in the room with us, the webinar room. And so my colleague Kaylee is going to send out a poll in just a moment. And we just ask you to respond on your screen with what your role is. Are you a state level leader, ESU leader, school-based leader, or other? And I'll just pause for a moment so you can complete that poll. And in just a minute, Kaylee will reveal the results. Okay, Kaylee's going to reveal the results in just a moment. We'll see who's in the room with us today. Wow, we have a wide range of people in the room and so many teachers with us too. Great. Thank you all so much for being here. Okay, so now that we know who's with us, let's move on. And we just want to provide some reflection time. Please reflect for just a moment or two, considering your school and your role, and think, how might the learning we've gone through so far, how might you apply that to your context? Please chat those into the chat box and I'll read aloud some that I'm seeing so that we can hear from a variety of folks in the room. The power of background knowledge, thinking about what we can do to focus on knowledge. Scaffolding text-dependent questions. Calm the worries of having to recreate entirely new curriculum. That's great. Oh, these are coming in so fast. Thank you. It's not about going back, helping teachers understand the importance of maintaining high expectations, supporting with vocabulary, gain a clear vision of instructional practices. I think that vision part is so important. We don't need to recreate the wheel. We should rely on our instructional materials, continue to focus on the shifts, and continue to know or to do what we know to be effective, which is building knowledge. Awesome. Great. Okay, so much of this is, so many of you I think are thinking about how to share this with teachers, how to set the vision, how to really make these strong literacy instructional practices a part of teachers' planning practices. And they continue to come in. I wish I could read them all. Thank you so much for these reflections. And we do encourage you to continue reflecting, of course, after this webinar wraps up. So we're now going to shift gears just a little bit and think about how to support foundational skills development in response to the missed learning this spring. But before we do, I want to name that this topic is more than deserving of its own webinar. It's probably deserving of its own series of webinars. So our purpose here isn't to unpack the topic in very great depth, but really to specifically name the key differences in the approach for foundational skills. We aren't able to do this topic its due justice today, I'll say that right now, but we hope that this guidance can support you in getting started. Additionally, organizations like Student Achievement Partners are currently working to provide more guidance around this for each grade band, so keep your eyes peeled for that guidance. Here you see the big 5 skills that students need in order to read proficiently. The instruction that we just discussed for the majority of the webinar, which is critical for all students, addresses and supports vocabulary and comprehension. All students must have opportunities to build their vocabulary and comprehension by engaging with grade level complex texts with appropriate teacher supports. But this approach that we just described for moving forward with grade level content does not encapsulate these other 3 buckets, the foundational skills of reading. These present a unique challenge, and when students come back in the fall, they may or may not be returning with these skills. They may have gaps from previous grade levels, and students in grades K to 3 specifically are likely to have missed critical skills in instruction due to the school closures. We want to take time now to explore how and why our approach to addressing gaps in foundational skills must be different from how we approach grade level instruction with complex texts. So here's a quote that really just emphasizes how critically important foundational skills of reading are. It says, "Students who fail to decode with automaticity will fail to read with fluency, and students who fail to read with fluency will fail to comprehend the rich, complex text needed to succeed in college, work, and life." What this quote underscores is that foundational skills open up the world of complex text and knowledge. Our students need both systematic instruction around foundational skills so they can unlock the words on the page, and they need deep engagement with complex texts that build knowledge in order to thrive as readers. So in Nebraska, as you know, the K to 3 standards include these foundational skills, which are pictured here. These are the kindergarten standards, but they go up through grade 3, and although there are less at each grade level, because the assumption is that students are mastering certain skills and are no longer needing instruction, they decrease in number as they move throughout the progression. So these are taught explicitly in the early elementary grades, but we want to acknowledge that foundational skills are important for all grade levels if they've not already been secured. And if we find that gaps exist for students in upper grades, we must make a plan to support them as well. So I've named before now that the approach for foundational skills, unfinished learning, must be different. But let's really get into the how and the why. And the most important difference is that foundational skills of reading are taught and learned most effectively when they follow a research-based systematic sequence. There's a developmental progression of skills that students must master in order to decode and read text fluently, and in turn to free up brain space for comprehension, which is the ultimate goal. We can think of this progression of foundational skills as a series of steps. If teachers did not have the opportunity to teach certain skills in this trajectory due to school closures, we can't expect students to proceed with skills later in the sequence. We can't expect them to be able to jump over steps that have been removed and keep walking up that path. So knowing this brings us to the question of how do we intervene to support students with foundational skills unfinished learning? And we have 2 recommendations to share today. The first is to use diagnostic assessments to identify missed learning. And the second is to address gaps by teaching missed foundational skills in this sequence to all students who need them. So let's first drill down on assessments. Why does assessment matter? Assessments are always important, but they're especially critical when diagnosing foundational skills needs. We can't make assumptions about what students can do and can't do when it comes to foundational skills. We must use assessments to find out exactly where they are on that developmental trajectory so that we can lay the foundation as needed and guide students further along this progression. And so there are 3 types of assessments that we can think about here. First, we have screening assessments or screeners, such as the MAP assessment. These can provide us with basic information to guide our decision-making. It's important to remember that screeners like MAP do not tell you what to teach or how to support students. Instead, they give us a benchmark for understanding who we might need to find out more about, or who to administer diagnostics to. Diagnostic assessments are more specific, and they can help you to determine if students need foundational skills support, and if so, where they are along that trajectory. The third layer is progress monitoring, which, as you know, refers to the process used to kind of assess students' progress as interventions and instruction are put in place. So today we're going to focus on the importance of strong diagnostic assessments in the beginning of the year. And we just want to point you towards some resources that Nebraska has developed to get you started with your assessment plan moving into the fall. And so for guidance on which assessments are approved for the 2021 school year, we encourage you to visit the Nebraska Reads Approved Assessments page. A note that these are K-3 approved assessments that you can choose from during planning. So as you begin thinking about how to support foundational skills, definitely visit this page and consider which assessment you will implement. So let's now move into how we might address these gaps that are identified from the assessments. So I want to emphasize here that there's not necessarily one right path forward in terms of how you'll accomplish this. This is hard work and critical work, but you'll need to consider the specifics of your context and your students' needs when planning to do this. So the important thing is that you do make a plan and you follow through when addressing these gaps for the students that you identify will need support with unfinished learning around foundational skills. So while we can't share the one right path forward, we do want to share some high-level guidance to support you in thinking this really challenging issue through. So one way you might want to approach this is to teach missed units from last year or components of missed units. This might be a good approach if your school already has a high-quality foundational skills curriculum in K2, and if the diagnostic assessments that you've administered are indicating that most of your students have needs that are aligning really closely with learning they would have gotten in the spring. This approach is going to be most relevant in the early elementary grades when these skills are being explicitly taught to all students. Another approach you could consider using is using intervention time strategically. By intervention time, I'm referring to any time in a student's schedule that's devoted to supporting literacy outside of core instruction. This might be a good option if your diagnostics indicate that students have a wide range of needs, they're kind of all over that progression, and if time exists in your schedule to do this. So this approach could apply to all grades, including older students who you determine, based on strong assessments, need additional support with foundational skills. So I also just want to point out briefly here that this work of addressing foundational skills needs is not new to many of you. It's really connected to the work that you K-3 leaders and teachers have been doing with individualized reading improvement plans in Nebraska. And just a reminder that those things are closely linked, and we know that many of you may have some questions circulating right now about accountability, and Marissa and Abby are happy to support and provide guidance around those. And you can also go to that Nebraska Reads page to find out more guidance around that, because we do know and acknowledge that that is definitely on everybody's minds this year, especially. So to stamp our key points here, it's going to be critical for you as leaders when thinking about foundational skills support to prioritize time and assessments and the creation of individualized reading improvement plans when needed. Teachers really need time to plan and to teach foundational skills, and they need guidance on what assessments to administer, when to administer them, and to whom. So this process is going to be an ongoing process as you monitor students' progress and adjust instruction accordingly. But what we really want you to walk away from this webinar knowing is that we must provide this targeted and systematic foundational skills instruction to the students who need it. And we have one last resource spotlight for you today, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. This is a fantastic resource called the Read at Home Plan for Student Success. This resource was created by NDE to assist families in understanding how to support their children's reading development at home. We really encourage you to share this with teachers and families of students in K-3 if you haven't already. It's also great because it's available in both English and Spanish. And so I so appreciate your attention today, and I'm going to kick it back over to Corey to wrap us up. But thank you again, and it was a pleasure to be with you all today.
Thanks, Julia. I feel like if we were in the room, we could give you a big round of applause. So I'm assuming everyone is giving you a nice little golf clap from the comforts of their home or office. A lot of good questions were coming up through the chat. So, you know, I think one of the challenges in this situation is a lot of the uncertainties. And so, JD, I think you had a really great question in terms of what happens if we're in remote learning and we have to administer diagnostic assessments into the fall. So I don't have a good answer for that, except know that I've read that, and I think that again helps us frame some of the, specifically the assessment webinar that we'll be having, but I think those are things that we're wrestling with right now. I also want to mention, I know I get lots of questions around the Nebraska Reading Improvement Act, and if you do have some specific questions about the law, please reach out to Dr. Abby Burke, our reading specialist. She's our go-to expert on the Reading Improvement Act. I think we're getting you know, most of the questions around summer learning handled. We recognize that the law requires an assessment within the first 30 days of school, so we'll revisit that towards the end of summer as we hopefully have a better idea of what school might look like in the fall, because a waiver to that would require the governor to sign, which we are certainly able to take back to him if needed. One thing that, so as we think about next steps, one thing I want to mention, there is a short survey, so we're going to put that in the chat box, and if you're able to complete that, that would be great. Just a few resources that I might just mention. So certainly as you're thinking about core instruction, taking a look at the Nebraska Instructional Materials Collaborative, I'm going to say I follow Student Achievement Partners on Twitter. They have just a ton of great resources in the literacy space. So if you haven't checked them out or don't follow them on social media, you might want to take a look at that. The other thing I might also call out, I appreciate the promotion of the Read at Home plan. I do want to point out that came from Mississippi Department of Education. They were kind enough to let us modify it for our purposes, but I've heard district leaders say that, you know, back in mid-March when everything happened pretty quickly, one thing that they did was make paper copies and got it in the hands of parents, and that's been helpful. We're working on getting that translated into Spanish, so we'll have that available as well for you. The other thing coming soon, and I previewed this last week on the mathematics webinar. So we're working to really zero in on grade level essential content for literacy and mathematics, because we know that that is something that's critical. I also acknowledge that math and literacy look a lot different. So the approach to mathematics may be similar, but also very different and specific for literacy. So as that becomes available, one thing that I anticipate being available in mid to late June is Nebraska-specific academic guidance. And I know folks want it now, but we're waiting on several pieces to come in. So we hope that the focus on summer, and then as we get towards mid to late June, that we really zero in on what the fall might look like. And this would include considerations for assessment, instructional materials, and professional learning, and those resources will be available on Launch Nebraska. So more things and more tools and resources will be coming out. If you have questions on the ELA or literacy front, reach out to Abby, and also Dr. Marissa Pazant is our ELA specialist. They are certainly willing and able to help. On Thursday, which is 2 days away, we'll have another webinar, same time, same place, same platform. We love Zoom. We'll have Summer Learning for Literacy, where we'll dig into some specific, deeper into some of the specific resources. And just a reminder, we will have this recording of the webinar as well as the slides up on the Launch Nebraska website, hopefully before Thursday's webinar. That's our goal, and we've been able to do that. Again, just want to say thanks for everyone's time today. There's the link to the survey. It's also in the chat box. We'll leave it up for just a few more minutes as we close out. And with that, we'll end just about 5 minutes early today. So thanks for everyone's time, and hope you have a great evening, and see some of you back here on Thursday.